In terms of geography, it's hard to get luckier than Canada. Surrounded on three sides by ocean, far from any adversaries, and with a long-term ally to its south, the land of maple syrup and hockey riots has seemingly little to fear from the outside world. Hence why successive governments have spent so little on defence over the last quarter century. When you have few vulnerabilities, putting only 1.22% of GDP into your military isn't such a problem. Or is it? In recent months, insiders have started to raise the alarm over Canada's defence spending, painting a picture not of a nation that's comfortably secure, but of one that's teetering on the edge of a self-inflicted crisis. A crisis in which plummeting military recruitment, aging hardware, and budget cuts are leaving Ottawa incapable not only of supporting its allies, but perhaps also of even defending itself. As damning reports go, they don't come much more damning than the recent two that dived into Canada's Department of National Defence, or DND. The first, published in November of 2023, was an annual look inside the department's finances. The second, written in December, was an internal document the broadcaster CBC later revealed to the public. But while one was intended for public consumption and one only for insiders, the two still pretty much said the same thing. To put it colloquially, Canada's military is screwed. Here's how Politico summed up the November fiscal report. Canada's military can't deploy multiple operations concurrently to the extent that it is supposed to be able to amid a recruitment crisis, aging fleets and infrastructure, and planned spending cuts. The internal report was even more brutal. In an overview of its findings, CBC wrote that, quote, only 58% of the Canadian Armed Forces, CAF, would be able to respond if called upon in a crisis by NATO allies right now, and almost half of the military's equipment is considered unavailable and unserviceable. It's likely that former Navy Commander Mark Norman spoke for many when he gave his reaction to the report on CBC, quoting, "This is borderline atrocious." The trouble wasn't so much the effects of low spending, although that has definitely played a part. A limited military budget has been a part of the Canadian model for over a quarter of a century now. Nor was it a lack of skill or passion in the military. In multiple areas, Canada still shines brighter than its peers, including in its world-beating special forces. No, the problem seems to lie deeper, almost on a psychological level. A psychology that can likely be explained by Canada's geography. While the last 2 years of Russian aggression have been an urgent and bitter wake-up call for NATO's European members, with even previous laggards like Germany at last reaching the 2% spending target this year, Ottawa seems content to keep on slumbering. After all, Europe is far away, as are Taiwan and China. And with the military superpower that is the United States on its doorstep, Canada knows it has a close ally that will always defend it from attacks. Speaking to the Financial Times, Indo-Pacific expert Jonathan Berkshire-Miller summed up Ottawa's thinking this way. Successive governments have tended to treat foreign policy as a luxury item and have left it to the Americans to step up to the plate, or the Japanese and the Australians in the Indo-Pacific. To be clear, this isn't some new phase that can be pinned solely on the current government. Although Stephen Harper talked a good game on defence, spending fell to an all-time low of 1% of GDP on his watch. Not that he should be singled out for blame either. For decades now, wars for Canada have been far-away things that are engaged in out of a sense of duty and allyship. Despite the rock-solid commitment and performance of Canadian troops in Afghanistan, it's doubtful that many saw the occupation as an existential issue. Certainly not in the same way that, say, Poland views growing Russian aggression. With the rise of a multipolar world, though, there are signs that this mindset is at last changing. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly recently said in a speech that, quote, "Our location on the globe, surrounded by 3 oceans, can no longer be relied upon to protect us." At the same time, recent polling by the Angus Reid Institute has shown that over half of Canadians now say the government should increase its defence spending, a number that rises to nearly 2/3 if a potential second Trump presidency is factored in. In actions too, Ottawa is starting to show it grasps the need to pull its weight. The Canadian development in Latvia on NATO's eastern flank is set to grow to brigade strength by 2026. In the Taiwan Strait, Canadian naval ships have begun joining US vessels in freedom of navigation operations. At home, the government has pledged to invest 40 billion Canadian dollars in air defense system NORAD over the coming 2 decades. Yet, for all things are starting to move in the right direction, there are concerns that it's not enough. that for all the government may boast about stuff like buying 88 F-35 fighter jets, the Canadian Armed Forces remain woefully unprepared for a new era of military confrontations. Especially when you realise that even now the government is not only failing to raise military spending, it's actually cutting it. When Ottawa's critics point out that it spends well below the NATO 2% threshold, defenders of the current policy like to reply that the figure's misleading. After all, Canada is the world's 10th largest economy. While it might only spend 1.22% of GDP on defense, that's still a heck of a lot of money. In raw dollar terms, that even puts it in NATO's top 7 spenders, way ahead of smaller countries like Estonia that spend over 3%. The trouble with this way of looking at things is that NATO spending is not static, and many members are rushing to splash more cash. Poland, for example, is hiking defense spending to over 3.5%. Turkey is increasing its spending to an eye-watering 4%. That means this whole 7th place in raw dollars thing won't hold even if Canadian defense spending remains stable over the coming years. But staying stable isn't on the cards. Even as most of the rest of NATO are increasing their military budgets, Ottawa is heading in the opposite direction. Now, for anyone who's listened to Canadian ministers on the news talking about how they're investing in the armed forces, this might seem a bit counterintuitive. After all, the Liberal Party government has made a big deal of the additional 8 billion Canadian dollars that it pumped into defense spending following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the coming cuts are visible in the government's own spending projections. Estimates tabled in the House of Commons back in February show the planned defense budget dropping from 26.49 billion Canadian dollars in 2023 to 24 to 25.33 billion Canadian dollars in 2025 to 26. That's a reduction of over 900 million Canadian dollars. And bear in mind that it'll affect the 2024 to 2025 budget as well. Overall, Defense News estimates that cuts will total 1.7 billion Canadian dollars by the end of 2026. The cuts are not across the board. Important investments like upgrading NORAD will not be affected, and key capabilities should be shielded. Instead, the government hopes to make the cuts by slashing travel budgets, the use of private sector contractors, and spending on infrastructure. Still, it is a sign that Ottawa has differing priorities to most of NATO. According to projections, over 19 of the alliance's 32 members should hit their 2% commitments in 2024. Canada, meanwhile, would have to spend an estimated $75.3 billion to close the gap, something the government simply isn't interested in doing. We know this, thanks to leaked documents that appeared in the Washington Post in 2023. Among them were reports that Justin Trudeau had told NATO allies that Canada would never meet the 2% threshold. Now, we should be fair here and note that Ottawa is not alone in this. As we covered on a recent video on spending levels within the alliance, countries like Belgium and Spain likewise steadfastly refuse to hit their NATO commitments. But Belgium is a tiny country with a perpetually divided government, and Spain has no pretensions about being a military power. Canada, by contrast, aims to be an active mid-level power. The 2017 policy document Strong, Secure, Engaged remains the official guidepost for how Ottawa sees its global military role. One key section outlines how the armed forces should be able to manage, we quote here, 2 sustained deployments of 500 to 1,500 personnel in 2 different theaters of operation, including one as a lead nation. The November 2023 D&D report, however, makes it clear that this is not something they're currently capable of doing. Not just because spending levels are low now, but because they've been low for decades. Global News reports that the military budget has now stayed below 1.4% for 26 years. Such persistent underfunding affects not just Canada, but also Ottawa's ability to help its friends. In a recent article, War on the Rocks noted how, quote, Canada's national security apparatus remains weak for a country of its size, wealth, and geography. Currently, its deficiencies in military spending and capacity mean that it is unable to contribute much beyond providing stern warnings to deter a possible Chinese military invasion of Taiwan. As we're about to see, there's good reason for this. With such low spending over so many decades, Canada's military hardware isn't exactly in great shape. With any military, there's expected to be a gap between the equipment it has on paper and what it can actually put into the field in an emergency. The reasons why are pretty obvious. Stuff in storage might need time to return to full working condition. Ships or aircraft might be undergoing repairs or upgrades. Some older items may simply be waiting for replacements that have yet to be delivered. So, it's not all unusual to read that Canada's military hardware wouldn't be 100% ready to deploy if war broke out tomorrow. What is unusual, though, is how glaringly large the gap is between Ottawa's on-paper strength and the reality. According to the internal December report leaked to CBC, all branches of the Canadian Armed Forces are crippled by a lack of kit in fit state. The numbers are staggering. 46% of all the equipment in the Army is considered unserviceable. For the Navy, the fraction of frigates, submarines, Arctic offshore patrol ships, and defense vessels that cannot be deployed is over half. The Air Force is in even worse shape. The report says 55% of its hardware is, again, unserviceable. These numbers are compounded by similar problems affecting military infrastructure, problems that were highlighted in the public November report. To quote, "A significant number of assets are approaching or have surpassed their life expectancy and have deteriorated." As Politico summed up the grim news, quoting again, "Military fleets are hampered by a mix of badly needed repairs, obsolescence, personnel shortages, and inadequate maintenance infrastructure." We give you a flavour of just how bad this is by briefly zeroing in on one branch as an example. And that's the Navy. The Royal Canadian Navy is running on a fleet of ships that are aging and in danger of becoming outdated. The country's 12 frigates, the backbone of the Navy, are over 25 years old. The Economist notes that the 4 submarines backing them up are even older hand-me-downs from the British Royal Navy. Perhaps even worse is the lack of naval replenishment vessels. According to War on the Rocks, quoting again, "Were these ships to be used in a military operation, they would be of limited use given that Canada's one dedicated naval replenishment ship lacks Navy-grade radars or even a self-defense system, which critics argue makes it unfit for a war zone." This is just one branch of the military, but it is emblematic of wider problems. The Air Force likewise runs on outdated kit as it awaits the arrival of new F-35s in 2026, mostly CF-18s from the 1980s and used F-18s that once belonged to Australia. The problem here doesn't just stem from low overall defense spending, but also from how the government prioritizes what money is available. The National Post notes that a typical military will put aside 20 to 30% of its budget for replacing outdated kit and investing in new technologies. Ottawa, however, puts aside just 10 to 15%. As the Post writes, "This has forced the military to soldier on with obsolete and worn-out equipment while it waits for replacements." The problem is compounded by something that bedevils other NATO allies from Britain to Germany, a procurement system that prioritizes fiscal caution over speed and efficiency. Public Services and Procurement Canada is the body responsible for overseeing purchase of all federally funded programs, and its remit is to ensure money is spent in a low-risk, fair way. While that's a laudable aim, it often clashes with the realities of military procurement, whereby kit often has a single potential supplier and may need to be approved relatively quickly. So you get stuff like the remotely piloted air system program, which took 17 years to secure drones. According to the Post, most of Canada's allies took 4 years or less to undertake the same process. Now, we don't want to just stand here pointing fingers. Often, these sorts of procurement processes become Byzantine nightmares, not because pen-pushing officials take delight in hobbling the military, but because successive governments have brought in more and more rules in an attempt to make the system more accountable to the taxpayer. And, as we said earlier, that is a laudable aim. The trouble is that it's also a mindset that's only possible in peacetime. With Russia gearing up for a confrontation with NATO and the Chinese threat to Taiwan growing by the day, a system that prioritizes speed is becoming increasingly important. Although, even a drastic change to procurement might not be enough to turn the good ship Canada around. Because it doesn't matter how efficient your equipment purchases are if there's nobody capable of using them. And it's time to look at the biggest problem bedeviling Canada's military, an inability to recruit enough people to keep it ticking over. Officially, Canada's regular forces are supposed to stand at 71,500 personnel with another 30,000 in reserve. Since the pandemic, though, the military has been hemorrhaging recruits while simultaneously failing to bring in new talent. According to figures published in the fall of 2023, the actual strength of the regular forces was down to 63,149. The reserves, meanwhile, had dropped to just 22,217 personnel. Said out loud like that, those numbers may not seem wildly divergent. After all, a military of over 63,000 is still a military with lots and lots of employees. But that gap of roughly 8,000 makes a real difference on how effective Canada's armed forces can be, especially when you take into account the kind of people missing, mid-level people in technical and support roles. To see what we mean, let's again turn to the Navy, where the shortages are particularly acute. In a recent YouTube video, Naval Commander Vice Admiral Angus Topshee revealed that things were in a critical state, saying that many occupations are experiencing shortages at 20% and higher. Among those occupations are marine technicians, naval communicators, and combat information operators in the mid-level ranks, as well as naval engineering technicians at supervisor level. In some cases, the roles are 40% short of official targets, and that's a huge problem. While talking about militaries likely conjures images of men in trenches grasping rifles, the real thing that makes a nation's armed forces are the people in the support roles. The ones ensuring that all the kit actually works, that ships can leave dock, planes can fly, and that information flows are integrated. Losing people in these vital roles is like removing a body's central nervous system and expecting it to still function properly. Sure, from the outside, things might kinda look okay, but under the skin, it is a disaster zone. And disaster is exactly what these shortages may be. The Globe and Mail recently noted how, realistically, it will take more than a decade to generate mid-ranking officers and sailors replacements. Nor is it only the Navy that's affected. Politico reports that DND doesn't have enough people to maintain airplanes and expects that problem to linger for years. Exactly why Canada is facing such a shortfall of military recruits is a complicated question to answer. It's true that recruitment was picking up pace before the pandemic, although staffing levels were still low, so COVID may share some of the blame. It's also true that the private sector has been luring people away with better pay, creating a related retention crisis. But it's also true that the government sometimes seems too wedded to outdated models of recruitment. For example, there was a long-standing ban on permanent residents enlisting in the military. Desperate to boost numbers, the government overturned that ban in 2022. The result was a flood of 21,000 applicants from permanent residents, of which CBC reports that only 100 were ever hired. This isn't because all 21,000 were manifestly unfit nutjobs who turned up in t-shirts reading, "I heart the Wagner Group." Rather, it's because the extra security screening was implemented so slowly that applications took 18 to 24 months to process. According to official figures, the wait was so long that 15,000 just wound up walking away. It's attitudes like this that will have to change if Canada really wants to field the decent mid-level military claims that it wants. For all hardware and cash flow issues may be acute, the whole edifice will just collapse without the people to make it work. As we're about to see, that would be very bad for Ottawa, because the world is changing, and Canada's isolated position may not be isolated very much longer. In fact, the geopolitical battle for the Arctic may have already begun. As we mentioned on previous videos, there are only 8 Arctic countries in the world: the US, Canada, Denmark through Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Of these, Russia alone owns the majority of the land in the region, slightly over 50%. But Canada is far and away the second biggest player. According to Policy magazine, 40% of Canada's landmass is considered Arctic. Canada's Arctic coastline covers 162,000 kilometers. As global warming accelerates and new shipping lanes open in the once frozen north, that land is going to become increasingly valuable. Unfortunately, Ottawa is doing absolutely nothing to protect it. According to leaked US documents, Canada's commitment to the Arctic is so limited that, quote, significant Arctic capabilities and modernization plans have not materialized. That's a polite way of saying that while Russia has been building new ports and bases and expanding its military infrastructure in the region, Ottawa has paid the far north little thought. The Wilson Center has written about how Canada is NATO's weak link in the Arctic, stating that domain awareness is inadequate and raising the possibility that future Russian grey zone tactics might aim to create new facts on the ground before Ottawa is even aware that something is happening. Nor does the threat originate solely in Moscow. Despite having northern borders that stop way short of the Arctic, China has declared itself a near-Arctic power and has begun to move into the region. To quote the Wilson Center again, China's technological and military prowess could be a game changer in the Arctic over time, whether in partnership with Russia or on its own. Given that Ottawa has recently accused Beijing of meddling in its affairs, this is a threat that needs to be taken extremely seriously. As The Economist put it of Moscow and Beijing's presence in the Arctic, if the Canadian Navy is to respond to this, the money will have to be found for new frigates and submarines to give it a persistent presence in harsh conditions. They will also have to invest in new icebreakers. Canada currently fields 12 of these key vessels against Russia's 50. And while 2 more have been in the pipeline since 2021, the build schedule and costs are still being negotiated. This should really be the key section for anyone watching. While it's annoying as a European to have a Canada that can't easily back us up in NATO, it does at least sort of make sense. I mean, a Russian invasion of Europe or indeed a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is unlikely to represent an existential threat to Ottawa. But falling behind in the Arctic really could impact Canada's future security and economy in ways few people seem willing to grapple with. If nothing else, the government should at least be prioritizing defense spending in the far north. Still, we don't want to end this video on a down note. For all there are long-term serious issues facing the Canadian military, they are not unsolvable. Solutions do exist, so long as the political willpower is there to take them. When discussing ways Canada could fix its military, one obvious solution hangs over all the others. Spend more money, commit to hitting the NATO 2% target, or at least start heading in that direction. But we're going to put that aside for now, as it's unlikely to happen. And frankly, we wouldn't be adding much to the conversation by just repeating the same thing as everyone else. So, in this final chapter, we're going to take a quick look at a potential different route Ottawa could take. One that wouldn't force the government to spend more money, but could still make Canada's military more effective, both through its own defense and for helping its NATO allies. Name of that route? Specialization. The idea comes from a 2023 War on the Rocks article, which argued that rather than have an underfunded military that tries to do everything, Ottawa should instead zero in on the things that it's really good at and aim to become a world leader in them. To quote, Canada should focus its new investment on building up capabilities in key force-multiplying areas such as cyber, special forces, and energy security. Some of these, such as special forces, are straightforward picks. As we mentioned earlier, Canada's special forces stand among the best in the world and did sterling work in Afghanistan. So why not build out this ability? Why not invest in this area and create a larger elite group that can do things no one else can? It wouldn't be easy, but Ottawa is coming from a good starting point, with the bonus that this would be a far less expensive thing than buying new military hardware. Cost effectiveness is also behind one of the other suggestions from the article: investing in cyber. An increasingly important part of modern warfare, cyber capabilities are also among the cheapest to develop, especially when you consider that Canada already has a lot of local know-how. War on the Rocks gives examples of a thriving technology sector, 5 top 50 universities for computer science, and a strong cybersecurity private sector. The final suggestion is perhaps the most curious: investing in energy security. Canada has huge oil reserves, lots of natural gas, and some of the world's largest deposits of the critical minerals needed for making renewables. Now, this isn't news, but what is new is the idea that Ottawa could use those stockpiles to turn itself into NATO's energy provider. The idea comes from the way Vladimir Putin has weaponized Russia's energy supplies to Europe over the Ukraine conflict. When he shut off the taps to the continent in the summer of 2022, there were serious fears that Europe would freeze that winter, or that industry would collapse and plunge the continent into a deep recession. In the end, while inflation and energy prices did get miserably high, the worst predictions didn't come to pass. But that's only because we Europeans got lucky. The winter of 2022 to 2023 was unbelievably mild. China was still in lockdown and not buying up the world's LNG, and allies like the US and Norway worked pell-mell to keep us supplied during the crunch. In other words, the energy cutoff could have easily worked. So why not stack the deck so NATO never has to face such a problem again? Why not transform Canada into the alliance's energy guarantor in the event of any future conflict? Now, these are all just ideas, and we're not necessarily saying they're the only way forward. Focusing on specialization would mean downsizing other parts of the military, and it's easily possible that we'd all live to deeply regret spending cuts in other departments. But we mention them because it's clear that something needs to be done, that the option of Ottawa just kicking back and relying on geography and the US to protect it is no longer sustainable. Because make no mistake, there are decisions that need to be taken now to secure Canada's long-term security. Decisions that, if delayed much longer, could result in Ottawa being unable to patrol its Arctic or help deter an invasion of Taiwan or fulfill its obligations to NATO partners in Europe. It may be that the Canadian government doesn't believe it needs to spend more on defense. But in that case, it needs to start thinking of creative ways to address the other problems in this video. Problems that are only going to get worse the longer they're ignored.